about how to manage the boat with a crosswind and a cross sea if you don't want to go either in the wind or out of it. So every time the waves approached, the boat had to be headed up into them, and then veered away afterwards in order to maintain the line of direction. And it was slow work, chugging across the Fallen Sound. And of course, the time came to refuel, and where the engine had to be turned off because I couldn't hold this jerry can full of fuel, and the boat bucking up and down and pouring it into the neck of the tank of the outboard engine. However, the job had to be done, and then the question came about restarting the engine again, and so we went through the usual rigmarole, and so on down. And fortunately, apart from the wind whipping up spray which covered us in the boat, and you became saturated with the spray, it turned at last into the fjord up to Longyearbyen, where the sea was calm and it was sheltered, and the wind dropped, and it became the main difficulty was to keep awake, as it was suddenly a lot warmer. And in due course we arrived after, I forget how many hours the journey took, but maybe 10, maybe more. By this time my clothes had dried out, and I was covered in the dry white salt. So it was a relief to arrive, and Atkinson was taken off to the clinic. Whilst he was being dealt with the assistance of somebody, I'm not sure whether it was the radio, the kind of the radio, small radio station there. I think it was there that I told them about the problem we had with the outboard engine, and suggested that in order to avoid the need to shut down the engine in order to refuel it, that it would be helpful to have a little a piece of piping welded onto the top of the petrol tank, to which a tube could be attached, and the similar tube attached to the piping attached to the jerry can, in order to be able to pour and refuel the tank with the engine running, and they did that. But it would have probably been a lateral thinking to be a little bit more imaginative, to consider why it was that the engine didn't start easily. And as it transpired, when we eventually got back to the UK and returned the engines to Seagull and told them about the difficulty, they came back a few days later saying the reason why the engine had not functioned properly in the starting was that the needle of the float chamber in the carburettor was slightly bent.
Oh.
And that with the correct one in place, it worked perfectly. Well, I can't recall either of us who had no mechanical knowledge attempting to look for cause for the problems by opening the engine up. And, of course, wise after the event, the clever thing would have been to suspect that something to do with the carburettor was a problem, or might be a problem, and take a spare carburettor float chamber with you. However, we didn't. Atkinson was discharged after surprisingly few days, and it would appear that penicillin, or whatever they gave him, brought down the inflammation and his fever, and seemingly right as rain, we set off back, courtesy of whether of the governor or the mines company, to Prince Charles Foreland. And soon after we got back, we embarked on the circumnavigation of Prince Charles Foreland, pursuing the aims of the expedition, which was to stop here and there in order to do this work of follow-up checking and so forth. So back to sea again, and sailing right down to the southern tip of Prince Charles Foreland, and then rounding the tip. And that was the first slightly alarming experience, because we hadn't given ourselves enough leeway, and found ourselves close to a lot of small breaking waves, obviously reefs running out from the tip of the island. And so we steered out to sea, and then eventually turned north up the west coast of Prince Charles Foreland, and effectively in the Arctic Ocean. We reached our first stop-off point and landed with, I wouldn't say some difficulty, but with some damage, because trying to guide the boat in between rocks and other things, we managed to splinter off or splintered the sides of the blades of the oars, which reduced our oars to little more than poles, of which more anon. We made camp and set to work. It was mostly for Atkinson's benefit that we were there, and that being so, it was decided that I should return to the base hut, walking across the island up over a col, a not very high one, probably about 2,000 feet or less, but easy terrain, and bring more fuel back, just to give us a cushion.
Yes.
So I did that, and spent 2 days entirely by myself in this Arctic wilderness, and it was, in a way, it was interesting. It was rather eerie, having become separated from one's partner, and waking up alone in the hut and so forth. It was exhilarating in one sense, but rather creepy in another. Anyway, I took one of our jerry cans of fuel there and put it in my rucksack, and it proved a very hard, disagreeable burden, because it's a sort of dead weight, and our sacks, which were the Bergen frame rucksacks, which were thought to be the bee's knees at the time, it didn't settle comfortably on the back with a 5 gallons of fuel in a can in the back. So it was a tedious march back
Yes.
to the